We're called the Southeastern Swamp Stewards, and we're the only chapter around in the Robeson County, Brunswick County, Columbus County area, and we're excited to share with people the wonders of wildlife. This event, especially with John Gerwin from the Museum of Natural Sciences in Raleigh, yes, we are very, very happy to have him here telling us some stories. We do have a few other events coming up that we would love for you to join us for. One is John Gerwin himself on September 13th is doing an entire day's worth of events here at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, our Whiteville branch. So that will be advertised and posted through the Wildlife Federation as well as through our museum. And he's planning on doing a guided walk, possibly a bird dissection, of course, talking about local birds, and hopefully a secret in the afternoon that we're planning that if the birds cooperate, will work out for us. Another event we have coming up is on October 4th. The Kohari tribe here in southeastern North Carolina is doing a paddle along the Black River. It's going to be in the Three Sisters area of the Black River, and that will be, and I think it's a 9-mile paddle, so it's not for beginners, but that registration link page just dropped in the chat for us. So we'd love to have you join us for that event as well. So introducing John, oh my gosh, you guys know, everyone that's here, there's so much I could say. The resume, it's like 500 pages long. What do you say? What do you say? Wonderful human being. So happy to have him here. He is going to share some stories, birds of the Southeast in the swamp area, which we are all very concerned about, our local swamps and taking care of them and seeing them help. As you're listening, if you can drop your location in the chat, we're kind of keeping track of where all you came from, and I will hand it over to John. Welcome.
All right, thanks. Great to be here. Looks like it stopped raining outside. I've had so much rain this year, so I guess it's appropriate. We're talking about wetlands. And I will just go ahead and start do a share, get this going, the usual PowerPoint. Um, the word swamp means different things to different people, so I often convert that over to forested, forested wetlands. So I've done some work in my career here, which is I've now been here 37 years. I've done work in a couple of land um, places, a couple of properties that have to do with riverine, bottomland, hardwood forest. And so I thought, well, what we talked about during this program, I thought I'll break it up into two things. One is just some general bird information, or some stories about certain species, just things that come to my mind when I think about the forested wetland. Now, I could talk about 250 species that might be found in a given patch of forested wetland in a given year, but we don't have time for that. So I just, picked maybe a couple dozen. But and then at the end, I'll focus on the work I did specifically with my graduate students and technicians on one bird in particular, which is Swainson's warbler. So, with that, I'm just going to jump into it again. I'm just going to go through some different species, things that I associate with the bottomland forest. Right off the bat is the swallowtail kite, or what we now some refer to as the American swallowtail kite. Fantastic. That's a raptor, and it's in a way like a flycatcher. It's an aerial forager. Often it's an aerial insectivore. A lot of what they feed on, dragonflies, katydid. The katydid they'll grab out top of a tree. I've seen a kite grab a bat out of the top of a tree. Others report seeing them get small reptiles out of trees, but otherwise they're in the air, flying around foraging. You may have seen them down in the New Hanover, Brunswick region. That's a somewhat recent development. This species used to occur all the way up to the Ohio Valley, but sometime in like the mid 1900s, something changed, and their range really contracted all the way down to South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Mississippi. It was a really big shrinkage, and I don't think anybody knows why for sure. But then, starting maybe 15 years ago, birds started moving north. People started seeing them again during the breeding season further north, and At one point, a pair showed up down on the Cape Fear. In fact, there are some hanging around the Three Rivers region now. So now we seem to have a few more pairs nesting in North Carolina. Uh, the photograph here, the bird, I found some of these in Mississippi kites that were migrating a couple of years ago. I was down at the Green Swamp, and this was late July, early August, and they're heading south. So related is the Mississippi kite. So this is a bird that used to only be in one part of the state. When I moved here 37 years ago and wanted to see some, people said you have to go to the Broadneck Swamp on the Roanoke River. I did go. I never found them, but and then again, it seemed like maybe 15, 20 years ago, some birds started showing up in different places. The first time we had a nesting pair outside of the Roanoke, and now they're in a variety of places in the coastal plain, including New Hanover and Brunswick County. The bird on the right is molting. That's interesting that these were birds migrating again there was a mixed flock of the swallowtail Mississippi kites when I was at the Green Swamp, and it's an energetically expensive process to both migrate and to molt. But here this bird is doing that. These are also like the swallowtail kite. They forage on the wing. For the most part, they're grabbing dragonflies and other aerial insects, large insects out of the air. When I think of the bottomland hardwoods and I think of a hawk, this is the one that I think of most. You can't go into a patch of bottomland forest without hearing red-shouldered hawks. They're very vocal. This is the adult on the left, immature on the right. It takes them a couple of years before they molt out of this young plumage into the adult clothing. A lot of people are familiar, if you know birds at all or bird watching, you're familiar with the flight profile where even as a young bird, whether it's adult or young, you see this whitish, almost a half moon, crescent moon shape. Not all the birds show it, but probably 80% when they're in flight. It's one good way to do identification if you get the right lighting. These guys specialize on feeding on snakes. So here's the one on the left is got a garter snake and just caught it in one of my neighbor's yards. And his wife got this photo. She's a photographer by trade, so it was good timing, fortuitous. um, and then I don't really have to say much about a barred owl because if you know anything about bottomland forest, then you know barred owls. I mean, they're everywhere across the state, and they're in many urban areas. They're really adaptable, flexible, widespread owl, but they are. When we were doing our projects on the Roanoke River and the Great Petey River, the owls were out there all day long. They're very chatty, talking all day, all night, and they were very confiding. We would be walking around doing our work, and they'd just be sitting up in the trees watching us. And anyway, they're sort of the ecological nocturnal equivalent to the red-shouldered hawk, daytime. Although, again, we see these out in the daytime as well. And then something that not everybody thinks about when they think about, say, forest, is that there are a variety of herons that will show up either in the woods or particularly along the edge. And also when you're thinking about bottomland hardwoods, there's change, right? There's hurricanes that come through. So there's a lot of storm damage that opens things up. That creates edge. You might have forestry, timber harvesting going on. That creates edges. And then those trees are usually allowed to grow back. So you've got this succession of different forest stages. And when that's occurring, you have different microhabitats. And it's at those times when different species will come in, including different herons. So the little bit of heron on the left is actually showed up. When I say inland, I mean inland. This is more of a coastal species, but this bird showed up across the street from our house in Raleigh, right off the highway. We used to have this little lake over there. It's now been drained, but it was very marshy, and it's surrounded by a bunch of woods. And this is an adult. And the one over here on your right is immature, and above that is a snowy egret. And I wouldn't expect snowy egrets around any trees, but or forest, big forest. But the young little blue herons are often mostly white, so they can look like a snowy egret to some. But they show up. You get just a little opening patch, and it gets wet at all, some wet mud or again, some timber activity, you'll often get these guys to show up. I think everybody knows great blue heron. This is just one of the most adaptable species out there, so you can see them just about everywhere. They're sort of like the barred owl of the heron world. They're everywhere. But again, if you've got some harvesting or storm damage and things open up just a little bit, you got a wet ditch, then you'll get some great blue herons in. And they eat a little bit of everything. And then a couple more. I will sometimes be in the forest and come across an open area with water in it, and there'll be something like a green heron on your left. I've seen white ibis in those forested situations. The green heron will often nest pretty far away from water, so they go to forage, but then take the food to their young. And then on the right is a yellow-crowned night heron. You might come across black-crowned night herons in the woods, but yellow-crowned in particular can be found in forested area. They feed on they will in the wood they will feed on crayfish, for example. More on the coast they'll go after crabs, but the thick bill they seem to specialize on crustacean like things. There are a lot of woodpeckers in these forests, and I'm only going to talk about this one, the yellow-bellied sapsucker in the Piedmont coastal plain. It's a migrant and winter resident, so they show up in the fall down there, and then they spend the winter. We have a few that breed in the mountains. These are two males. The female has a white throat. The young ones can be even more mottled looking and more patchy looking. But the one thing that they do is they make these holes in the trees, and some people are not familiar or know what these are, and often it's just a line. Like this line here has already calloused over a bit, and this line here, they look like somebody took a machine gun to the tree. They're doing that to cause the sap to flow. They're interested in the sap. It just so happens some bugs will show up, but they don't spend much time even going after the bugs. We've watched them a lot. We did a study in the mountains, and they're built to go after the sap. Their tongue is modified to lick sap, and other animals will come in. So I've seen interesting butterflies, hummingbirds, nuthatches, and up in the mountains, red squirrels coming in and taking advantage of the sap wells when they're flowing. But you will see a lot of yellow-bellied sapsuckers in a bottomland hardwood, and they also switch to fruit. All the woodpeckers switch to fruit in the winter, and that's another thing. If you're in those forested areas where you have all these vines, including poison ivy, but the different vines that like a Virginia creeper, they will produce fruit, and all the woodpeckers consume a lot of fruit in the fall and winter. And somewhat related to woodpeckers are crows. In the eastern part of the state, it is mostly yellow-billed cuckoo. Every now and then, people find some black-billed cuckoo down east. That's a bird that's rarely found in the mountains and more up north. But in North Carolina, it's really yellow-billed cuckoos. People refer to them as the rain crow. You can look that up online if you don't know why. Fun little folklore. Anyway, they nest. They will nest late in the summer, later than most other birds. Most birds are finished by the end of July. The way cuckoos do what they do, they will sometimes have a nest started in August. That means they won't have young leaving the nest until late August or early September. It's a pretty sizable bird, as you can see, that we're holding the one here on the right. And there's a pair over here on the left that one of my colleagues got a nice photo of. They're just doing what they're trying to make more cuckoos. And I point this out, a blue-gray gnatcatcher because of the nest. It's actually one of the most common birds in the whole country, really. The blue-gray gnatcatcher is everywhere, and there are a lot of them. And it's a small bird. This guy is probably 3.5 to 4 inches in length. And but the nest is just adorable. If you know a hummingbird nest, you might think, well, that just looks like a hummingbird, but it's actually the gnatcatcher. They do the same thing. They use spider webs and lichens, and you can see this one has put lichens on a branch. They do it on top just the way hummingbirds do, and here's a branch above it with lichens, so it blends right in. And this photo just shows the female sticking her head out a little bit, so you can see it actually is a gnatcatcher. The nest is like 3 or 4 times bigger than a hummingbird. But it's a neat adaptation for nesting. They really blend in. If you don't see the bird carrying nest material or carrying food to the nest, they're pretty hard to find. There are a half a dozen wrens in the state. When you get into the woods, there are mostly two. The one on the left, there are two photos on the left are of the winter wren, and by their name, they're here in the winter. They show up in the fall and then spend the winter, and they're gone by late winter, early spring, heading back north. It's much more of a boreal bird, and it's a tiny bird. You can see I'm holding that one in the middle, and you can see how small that is. They are um, they're here. They're all around in the winter, but they're very furtive. They run along like a little mouse along down logs, and they get into the dense tangles of dead sticks and branches and things. They can be pretty hard to to find, even though they're all around. They make a little clicking sound that lets you know they're there, but when they're not sitting still, you might have a hard time seeing one. On the right, everybody knows Carolina wren, and we think of Carolina wren as just one of those urban birds, and they are. They're very adapted to the urban setting. But I would say if it's a forest bird, and if somebody had been out there in the 1700s doing really good bird surveys and keeping notes and such, they would have found that this is a bird of of forested areas, and it can be forest in the Piedmont or in the coastal plain. But doing our work like we did years ago in the PD and the Roanoke, and that's what I'll talk about later with the Swainson's warbler. But the Carolina wren was maybe our fourth most common bird in that landscape. So I'm going to switch, show a few warblers. Most of the warblers in our area are what we call a neotropical migrant. The neo referring to new, so it's a new world tropic group of new world tropical birds, and they are migratory. So these are birds that come here in the spring and they breed, and then they head back somewhere in the fall, spend the winter elsewhere. Many of them do not overlap where they go. For example, this is the American redstart. Most of them go to Caribbean islands for the winter. Some of the others I'll show you go to Mexico or Central American countries. Others go to South America. Um, that's an adult male on the left and a young male on the two right. It's I refer to what I mean by young male. They show something called delayed plumage maturation. There's a few birds that do this with their plumage sequence. Indigo bunting and painted buntings show this, where what happens is a bird like the one in the middle or the right will hatch out, and then after about a month they do their first molt. All songbirds do that, and then if it's a young male, it'll look like this, and it will then migrate. And when it comes back, it does not molt. It holds on to this plumage during its first breeding season. It may or may not. Actually, I think there's a female over here. Yeah, my little pictures here. Oh yeah, that's the female. All right, just a male in the young male in the middle. So they will come back and look like this. They may or may not breed as a young male. And then later in the summer, so about when they're 14, 15 months old, do a second molt. And when they molt that time, then they will look like Big Daddy. So you can see that the yellow is orangey yellow, whereas the female here is more of what I call lemon yellow. These birds, from a little bit of work we did and colleagues in South Carolina, doing some surveys, found that they're only on certain rivers, and those are the rivers we refer to as a brown water river versus a black water. The black water rivers they drain the coastal plain, and they are the typically ones with cypress, tupelo, and it's real tannic water. The brown water rivers are draining the Piedmont, and they have just a different geochemistry. And we'll talk a little bit about that with the Swainsons. Just a couple more pictures of the male. So here's an older male on the left. Again, he would be at least 15 months or more, and he has undergone 2 molts. And here's the young guy on the right. Even under the wing, it says peachy salmon color. It's not the most common breeder down in the coastal plain, but they're there in some scattered locations, and then all the way up into the mountains. A bird that I associate with waterways is the yellow-throated warbler, and way back in the good old days, they used to call it the sycamore warbler. And as you probably know, that's a tree that's all along waterways. And the males and females, they look alike. They're both gray back, the yellow throat. They're usually pretty high up in the tree. Uh, Here's one over here, typical view from below, singing away. The birds in the middle are migrating, and they were hanging out with this Cape May warbler. But it's just one of those birds that I associate with the bottomland hardwood forest. If I'm in the Piedmont or the coastal plain and I want to see a yellow-throated warbler, I'm gonna go to either the edge of the river, edge of a creek, or one of the mill ponds and look and listen there. They will nest in Spanish moss. I don't know how frequently. I just know that of the three or four nests that I happened to watch adults coming and going, they were all in a bundle of hanging Spanish moss. So I'm guessing it's probably a typical thing for them to do uh, when there's Spanish moss around. One of the most common warblers around is northern Parula. They do occur all the way from the coastal plain and up into some of the highest mountain areas. The northern Parula. This one's molting. The males have that sort of chestnut patch under the throat, the chin region. But not a whole lot to say other than they will also use some Spanish moss when they make a nest. And but it's a small warbler. It's another migratory one, and it's very abundant, and I associate it a lot with the bottomland hardwood forest. These are some females, so they're in the fall. And I mean, she's looking pretty good there. If you happen to see one from above and you're looking down, they have this greenish patch, brownish green patch on the back on the dorsal side. That's it's hard to see that because most of the time this bird is way up in the canopy. And perhaps one of the most identifiable, recognizable birds in the swamp is one that a lot of people will refer to as the swamp canary, and that's the prothonotary warbler. If you've not heard of the protonotaries, that's where its name comes from. I'll let you look that up online. It's a fun little story to see the derivation of that word. The people who named birds long ago, they were very well-read people. They had interesting ways sometimes of doing the naming that they did. So the birds on the left there, they're males, and they actually are sort of like the red star with that difference in plumage. A young male would have this greenish olive go all the way up the head. The females are actually olive all over with just a little bit of yellow. So these are all males. And this is the cavity nesting bird. It's a secondary cavity nester. It does not make its own. It would depend on something like a downy woodpecker who comes along and makes a cavity, and then it comes along a year or two later and occupies it, builds a nest. And there are only two warblers in the U.S. that do that. One is out west, and this one in the east. And there's like 45 species of warblers in the U.S. So it's an interesting little adaptation. On your right are molting. These are some of the young birds I was saying how they come off the nest, and then after about 3 or 4 weeks, they will do their first molt. So these are two young prothonotary warblers. They're about 3 or 4 weeks old, and they're undergoing their first molt. And they do not look like a prothonotary warbler. It's kind of fun to see them in these different stages. And uh, and it's an important stage for them. They're getting their first real set of body feathers. They're going to keep the wing and tail feathers that they left with for another year, but they're molting the little downy feathers they first had. They're molting those out and growing in some new body feathers. And again, energetically, that's a costly thing, and so it requires a lot of nutrition, a lot of uh, additional feeding from the parents. They will continue to take care of the young for about a month after almost all the songbirds do that for about a month after the young fledge. Typically, and I'll talk about this with the swains, and typically a number of these birds will renest. The female will go and renest, and that leaves the male to continue to take care of them. And that's my artistic angle of one day I was leading a walk for the Whiteville folks, and we were over at the Lumber River, and I had some just a few people with me, and turned around. We were watching prothonotary warblers, and then I looked down in the water and I could see the reflection. So I thought that was kind of cool. My big artistic expression. There are two species of what we call water thrushes. These are warblers. The one on the left is Louisiana, and the one on the right is the northern water thrush. The Louisiana does breed across North Carolina, all the way from coastal plain up into the mountains. It is not a very common bird in the coastal plain. It's just not what they do. They're more in the Piedmont, west of I-95 and on up into the mountains. They prefer to be around moving water. They do forage at the edge of water. They get on the rocks. They're looking for aquatic insects or other arthropods to feed on. When we see northern water thrushes, we see them in a more broader variety of places. It can be more still water, more calm water, or we sometimes during migration catch them at the edge of woods or edge of meadows, not anywhere near water. They and then one of the interesting things about Louisiana water thrush is that, well, two stories. One, they show up in late March, and then they get going into April and May, and then by mid-June they're pretty much done. And then by early July we start catching birds that are clearly migrating. And by the middle of July, you probably won't be catching many at all, maybe from further north coming through. And then by the end of July, uh, we continue to do a bird banding study in the central part of the state, but we never catch these birds after July 31st, really. They're gone. They're already back. They're heading back south. Some of my colleagues in Nicaragua say they will see these birds show up by mid-August. So that they're only here for like 4 months of the year. And when I used to work in Nicaragua, I would work for a month every winter on some coffee farms and study birds and consult on the wildlife management. I would do a little bit of mist netting. We can use these nets to catch the birds, and we put the little tags on them. So I had one over a stream right near the lodge. And in 2006, we caught a Louisiana water thrush. I couldn't go back in '07. I went back in '08. I caught the same bird, same net, same stream. I missed 2009. I went back in 2010, caught the same bird, same stream, same net. I went back in 2011, caught him again. It was amazing. This little guy was, he would come back, he or she would come back to the same little patch of, it was a little creek on the coffee farm, very, very close to the lodge we would stay at and eat our dinners and lunches and all. And happily make a living there, but very tight a sense of place, though. Uh, it may look on a range map like, well, they can go anywhere, but they don't really do that. They go right back to the same spot they were going to in the winter, and then they come right back to the same spot where they were nesting in the summer. Anyway, fun little bird. So here's one that this is a little different. This is a bird that occurs in the coastal plain. There are some populations in the coastal plain. In addition to, if you look at the map here, you'll see they're in the mountains all the way up into Canada. It's actually a boreal bird. There's an isolated population in the Uwharries region of central North Carolina where I currently work. Doesn't even show up on the map. But then there's this population in the coastal region. And there's some genetic differences. But they only occur what we call non-riverine forested wetlands. So it's another type of forested wetland. It's another way, you have to manage these things. And typically in these types of habitat, it's Atlantic white cedar used to be prominent, but of course a lot of that was harvested for shipbuilding and other things long ago. And now there's a push to reintroduce Atlantic white cedar back on the landscape because we've lost most of it. We cut most of it out, but they're trying to get it back. There's still a big patch. I got an Alligator River and the Dare bombing range and such. Other habitat where I found a number of these birds when I was working in South Carolina on the West Vaco timberland. They had the stuff Tupelo cypress and red maple swamp forest, and we found about 20 black-throated greens in this little area. So that was interesting. That we don't really know why. They're just these isolated populations and you know how it gets started, but there they are. Just a colorful bird. There's a couple tanagers in North Carolina. The scarlets are more in the western Piedmont in the mountains, and in the eastern Piedmont and the coastal plain is the summer tanager. So if you're out there in some forested wetlands, you're gonna, you know, you're most likely to see well, if you see a tanager, it's going to be a summer tanager. The males are the red ones. The females are the goldy, brownish yellow. Some of the birds, young males, can get patchy red. Um, and then these migrate to Central America. This one, this is a real, you know, real a confusing one for a while. So this is a rusty blackbird, and there are there's a there's a boreal breeder way up in northern Canada, and then they migrate into the U.S. They migrate into the south central U.S. and they migrate into the southeastern U.S. And these are like two populations. The birds that migrate down to the southern Mississippi Valley region, the Delta region, their numbers have been pretty stable. The birds in the southeast, unlike the last 25 years, their numbers have been declined like 85%. And nobody really knew why. And that's about 15 years ago, a group was formed to start looking into it. Their first thought was to look at pollution, methyl mercury contamination. And the way they wanted to do that was to study the methyl mercury is going to be accumulated, it's going to accumulate in feathers. So the bird eats, you know, and insects. The insect has been on the veg or in the soil, picking up whatever's in the soil into the veg, into the insects, into the feather. And that signature stays. So if they could get what they wanted was feather samples from the early 1900s on through to the present. So they had almost everything except the early 1900s because there aren't many specimens. There were a few museums that have specimens from the early 1900s, and we were one of them. The other two museums would not allow them to have a feather sample, and they only wanted the tip of one wing feather. And I thought it was a good study, and I thought that was a very uh, reasonable request and a good reason. But some museums just don't want you to like alter anything. But I think that's what they're for. They're to be studied and used. So we have specimens from 1904, and we cut the tips off of four of the specimens to send up to the Smithsonian to do their analysis. In the end, they decided it was not methyl mercury poisoning, it was something else. Since that time, they decided to actually climate change where they breed. This is a bird of the forested wetlands, both in the breeding season and when they winter. And the forests where they breed in northern Canada have been drying out and allow predators to come into the nest. So that's what they think is going on. But anyway, I was happy to participate with our specimens from 1904. You know, nobody thought something like that would be used in 120 like 120 years later. But anyway, and then the other thing to note is you see all the little edging, that little gold edging. I think of them as like scallop potatoes. These guys, there's variation to how they look. They got the whitish yellow eye. This one's a little more rusty. These guys are the black and the gold. And then as winter goes on, they get blacker and blacker. And the reason for that is it's not molt. They don't molt. The edging on these feathers just wears away, and you're left with a bird that looks more like this. So this bird once had a lot of the gold edging on here, but now it's worn away. And as the season goes on, this will wear away and the rest will wear. By the time this bird is migrating north, heading back to Canada, it's going to be a black bird. Um, the same for red-winged blackbird and longspurs, a few birds that the reason that they look different is because of feather wear, not a molt. Well, the swamp sparrow is not really much of a swamp bird, but I'd be remiss if I didn't include it since it has the word swamp in it. And, you know, we're supposed to be talking about swamps and all that. They are in areas in some forested wetlands, but they're usually, it's got to be open or it's got to be edgy. It's got to have some storm damage, uh, got some low tangles and shrubs and brush and things growing up. But they're also out in the middle of the meadows and especially a wet meadow along along streams with a lot of grass or herbaceous vegetation growing. When they show up here in the fall, they've undergone a molt and they look mostly like this. They still have the chestnut patch to the wing here, but the top of the head, the crown is streaked. It's black and chestnut and the gray. And then in the spring, they undergo a molt, but only around the head and the throat region. And some of the upper chest. So here's a bird that is showing more chestnut in the head, and here's a bird which got a really fully crown. So if you happen to come across one in April, late April, early May, they hang around till early May. Uh, they look almost like a chipping sparrow here. They're pretty adorable. That, and then there's that chestnut patch to the shoulder and uh, wing area. Pretty diagnostic. Another bird that is notable in the winter here is the hermit thrush. It's not a rare bird at all. They're mostly a boreal bird. We do have a number of them now breeding in our mountains. It's mostly above 4,000 feet in the southern Alps. and but it's a common boreal breeder, and many of them move south into the southeast in the fall, and they spend the winter. They do eat a lot of fruit in the fall, like I was saying about the woodpeckers, so do the thrushes. Uh, and it's very much a bird of the bottomland from hardwood forest, so along the edge. And then there are other thrushes. Um, and if you look across this, I often ask people like, how many species do you think are here? Some people can guess, and some people are not so sure. And in fact, if you guess four, you're technically right, but one could say there's five because this one's now been split into two species. So, um, but they all occur here, and they will use the bottomland hardwood forest during migration. Uh, I'm not showing you the wood thrush. That's a different genus of thrush. They do some breeding in the coastal plain. They're more in the upper coastal and the Piedmont. But these are all. There's another hermit, a veery, and a Swainson's, a gray cheek, big nose type. Um, they all migrate through here. They migrate through Piedmont coastal plain and some through the mountains, and then they will eat arthropods on their way, but they will also eat a lot of fruit. This bird was in this holly tree eating fruit when I took this photo. Um, and of course, uh, um, they look pretty darn similar. Um, interesting group of birds, and they're going to different places. If you're a big-nosed thrush that looks like a great-cheeked thrush, you're only the only place they've ever found them in the winter is on Hispaniola, so in Haiti and Dominican Republic. Um, and then the great cheeks go further. They go to South America. The Swainsons are in Central and South America. The Veeries are going to South America. And then the hermits are just in the Southeast U.S. But they will all use some of that bottomland hardwood forest as they're coming and going. And then I'll go through my Swainson's warbler stuff. I spent a lot of my my life with students and technicians studying the Swainson's warbler. And I just want to, a shout out to some of them. We started in 1996. We went through to 2008. We were in two sites. Uh, that project was at Woodbury Tract in South Carolina. The other from '06 to '09 is the Roanoke River National Wildlife Refuge. Kim was around at first, and then Jennifer took over in South Carolina. Amelia was in South Carolina, and Neil was over in the Roanoke. And my helper Keith has been helping me with banding and data entry for about 25 years. He still entered band data for me. There's some other helpers. Um, these are colleagues at the museum. Becky used to be the assistant curator, spent a lot of time down there doing the field work. Sharna ended up being one of my grad students. She's now a wildlife biologist on Shaw Air Force Base. She comes up to North Carolina every other month to help with our banding project out in the Uaris. Sarah is now living up the street from us. You can't get rid of these kids sometimes. They just won't leave. But they all did a lot of work. They spent a lot of hours out in the middle of a buggy, wet, forested area, chasing the birds around. So the Swainson's warbler was first illustrated by John Abbott, or the earliest record we have. It was undated, but we know it to be earlier than 1806. The bird was named by Audubon in 1834. and males and females look alike. This is a bird that forages on the ground, really. I say almost exclusively because every now and then we'll see a bird grab a bug out of the live leaves, but it is so rare. It is a ground forager. They have a pretty big, strong bill, and they walk along the ground and they flip dead leaves looking for things like this moth under the leaf litter. So it is a leaf litter specialist. One small study reported that they eat beetles in Jamaica. I'll come back to that because we ended up doing a diet study in South Carolina. So this is where they occur. So it's a bird of the southeast. There's some populations up in the mountains in the southern Alps and the Alleghenies, but it's a coastal plain bird, although up the Mississippi Valley and then along some of the tributaries. So it's a forested wetland bird. And then they winter in the Yucatan, Guatemala, and Belize, and then some of the Caribbean islands. This is when we were working at our second South Carolina site. One of my students reported hearing a lot of them, and they were catching them incidentally. And I said, well, maybe we should look into this. And this is why, because even as late as 1994, remember we started in 96, people were saying it was the least understood avian species in North America. And my colleague Gary Graves felt it was one of the most poorly understood migratory warblers as late as 2002. So we knew we had something to offer because we had all these birds getting caught just by accident. So we knew if we focused, we could learn a thing or two, and that's what we did. So we wanted to just do a little of everything: nest biology, home range, territory sizes, breeding behavior, diet, how long do they live, do they come back, what could we learn? So we set off to do that. Our first site was the Woodbury Wildlife Management Area, which was part of international paper when we were there. And soon after our project ended, it became part of the South Carolina DNR Wildlife Management Area. So here we are. So here's South Carolina. Here's Marion County, where we are. And then so here's Marion County and next to Horry County. This is the little PD. So that's draining the coastal plain, like the Cape Fear and that region coming down. And then this is the Great PD draining out of the Yadkin, Catawba, Piedmont region of North Carolina, coming down to this little peninsula. So if we zoom in on that peninsula, here we are. So here's the Great PD coming down. Here's the little PD. And we had access to about a 10,000 acre site that was international paper. But our study site was just this little square, 1 square mile area. And we'll take a closer look at that. So here we are. There's our 1 square mile. This is bottomland hardwood here, and this you can see the Blackwater River here and a different one here. This is pine. They grew a lot of pine up here on the ridge, and then we can come from here and zoom in. And one of the things that I point out here is that notice that here's the river coming down, and then notice these other little capillaries. If this were your artery, and capillaries are coming into the swamp. This is a system that breathes. It's inhaling and exhaling water. When there's a lot of water, these are sloughs. The water goes in and then it feeds into these other little areas here and here and here. And when it's dry, they drain. So it's a pretty dynamic system. It makes it a little bit challenging to work, but it's also pretty fascinating. So here's the Roanoke River. There's the refuge system. They got several big tracks along the refuge. We did our work up in the Broadneck Swamp area, and so here's Broadneck up close. We just subsected that into 3 sections here and 2 sections down here at the Rainbow Trend. But you can see here's the Roanoke River coming down. So partly we did this because of how much money we had, manpower, women power, and all that. So I want to talk before I talk about the bird. I just want to talk about water because this really is driving the system and consideration. There's Sarah. I sent Sarah across. I said, Sarah, there's birds over there. I need you to go take a look. And she did. Crazy. But she swam over, and sure enough, this was early April. I knew there were some birds back, banded birds, and they were. She found some of our banded birds. So what are they doing? Well, they were finding the only high spots, dry spots that were out there, and they were trying to set up the first territory. So they show up in early April when we often have high water at our study site. But this is the kind of stuff that we had to work around. So this is one of the sloughs, and this is just in May, and we would just have to walk across, carry our gear, do our work, and there's high ground on either side. This is after hurricane when my Miss Sharna. We had birds over here with marked birds, and she wanted to know what was going on because we were locked out for 5 days because of the storm, and she finally just put all her gear in her backpack and took off across the slough. and and so we're working around the stuff, and so are the animals. So let's look at a hydrograph. So again, this is the Great Petite River draining the Piedmont of North Carolina. When these rivers have dams. The dams are operated when water gets too high. They release water, and that's what these spikes are. These are flows. So here are 4 years. These are the months, and this is cubic feet per second. So this particular year, there's a lot of water. That's a that's a super high flow rate. But it's a short uh, time frame. That's a pretty narrow spike. And you can see that along the Great PD, when they release the water from the dams, they were pretty narrow spikes. And then as you get into May, they're smaller, typical, and then June rolls around, and unless you have a hurricane, things are pretty dry. On the Roanoke River, it's a little different. And so here are 30 years of data. Again, cubic feet per second. And notice, I mean, go back and look at how most of the CFS is below 10,000 here on the Great PD, and here most of it is above. And also notice these spikes that came in. This is mid March to May 1st. That that meant that water is just sitting there. And I don't know if you're familiar with water that sits for that long, but that's just killing everything. So this was been a big challenge working with Dominion Power and asking them to not do this. But the refuge biologists have been tearing their hair out for many years to not allow this to happen uh, because this is really what you want. You want these narrow spikes because this is more natural. This mimics the natural flow thing. This is not natural. So when that water sits, it becomes very anaerobic. And so it's killing everything, whether there's microorganisms, the little invertebrates that birds be eating, the seeds in the soil, the low herbaceous plants that are in the soil, and it just becomes a bit of a desert out there. So anyway, that's the kind of stuff we're dealing with. Anybody who's working along these river systems and trying to do river studies as well as conservation work. So again, the hydrology is affecting soils and geochemistry, all this sort of thing. The one thing that happens when you have these floods, it scours the leaf litter. So for a bird like a Swainson's warbler, um, when things get scoured right there in March or April, now all of a sudden you don't have the leaf litter you want to forage under, but it doesn't scour the whole place. You can have 1 or 2 feet of difference in elevation, and the water may not reach those high points, and so you have this sort of Swiss cheese of areas with leaf litter and areas that are scoured. And then of course the trees are always growing and dropping leaves, and so it only takes a year for the leaf litter to build back up. And if it's a couple of dry years in a row, now you've got a lot of leaf litter and a lot of bugs under the leaf litter. So again, it's a dynamic system. So we'll take a look at some of the ways that we study the birds and what we learned from them. So the most basic, the crudest way we do it is we catch them. We use these nets, catch them, and we put little rings on their feet, little jewelry. And this one, the aluminum, most of you have probably seen it or heard of it. The silver one here, the aluminum, it has a 9-digit number like your social security number. And if you get the bird again, or if somebody finds it dead and they read the number, you can find out about it. But we didn't want to have to rely on catching them again all the time, so we have um, access to these colored rings, and some of them have 2 colors on them, like the black and white here. So pink, green, red, yellow, and we can use different combinations, and they're unique. So we had over time probably uh, 1,000 birds that we tagged over that 8 or 9 year period, but they were all different. So if you see a bird like that, you're out there with your binoculars and you see a bird perch and you see both feet, or you see one on one side, the bird turns around, you see the other. you can say, oh, it's got aluminum over black and white on the left and orange over yellow on the right. And then you can look that up in our library, our database, and we know who that is. And then we can keep doing that to record information about what the birds are doing on the landscape. And so that's how we did a lot of it at first. The first 4 years, this is what we did. It wasn't easy. They're hard to track. They're hard to follow. They're very shy. They don't respond to suspicion at all. They will respond to playback, but not the females so much. So it was challenging. So let me see. Is that my yeah? So what do we learn from some of that? So between some of the banding and some following them around, what we found is that most of the males come right back to the same territory. This is not news. I mean, most songbirds do that, but we confirmed. Some of the males would live into their 10th year. So these are some demographic tables from our band data. And these are all your young birds. Most young birds die in their first year. So here's a case where about, the second year, about 50% of them are gone. And then as the table goes on, more and more are dying. And that's typical. Their life history, your life table here. So you're getting way out here, but you can see there is a bird way out here that says after A9, it's after ninth year. It was in its 10th year. So there were probably more of those, and we just didn't document it. So these are males up here, by the way, and these are females down here. Some of the pairs repaired 2 or 3 times in subsequent years. That's unusual for songbirds, but we had these marked birds, and we knew that there would be, again, there were a few instances where a male would come back the second year and the same female from the year before would show up. And we had it happen a couple times where the female came back a third time, mated with the same male. They usually mix it up. So in between years, sometimes even within a year. But so anyway, that was an interesting thing to document. And for the males, our average lifespan is about 6 years. So this seemed to be where most of them were. And average, it's kind of a squishy number, fuzzy math, but that's kind of, but you can see more of what goes on here. Interestingly enough, we actually caught as many females as we did because of ground foraging. So we have the only decent data set on female swains and warblers. But you can see that once you get past that first year, which is the hardest year to get past, their numbers are just or the age is just consistent. I think it's hard to be a female bird, and I think it's hard a female swainson's. Um, so they didn't seem to they don't show the same pattern here, but we haven't really analyzed that in a really robust fashion. But it's suspicious that it showed that pattern. So, so again, most first year birds do not live into their second year, so you've got to get through that first year. Then after that, your chances of living go way up. This is what their nests look like. So we did a lot of nest searching, and this is a huge nest for a bird that's only around 15 grams. That's half an ounce. Uh, it's hard to tell, but this bird's nest right here, this thing's as big as a mockingbird, it's bigger than a cardinal nest. And all this stuff hanging down, that little female warbler is cramming all this stuff, and she does it inside this matrix, this vine matrix. She does not weave it, sew it on. She doesn't put mud and glue it on. None of that. The stuff is just kind of crammed in. It's pretty artsy craftsy because these vines are crisscrossing, and so when you bump the nest, a few vines will move, but not all of them. If you bump it on this side, those vines move, but not these. And if you over here, so it's as if it's supported by these different vines, but from different angles and sides. And I don't know if that has to do with like not wanting to get knocked over in a storm or not wanting to be if there's a depredation event going on, maybe it dissuades certain predators. I don't know, but it was just notable that of how they built it and how big, and these leaves were provided crammed in all over, were providing the support by virtue of touching different sections of the vine matrix. So here's a nest, and you can see all the tangle of vine. In this case, it's a trumpet creeper mostly. Sometimes it's a real big mix. If you look real close, you can see there's a female sitting in there. If you can't see it, there's her eye right there, and there's her little eye line right there, and then there's her tail sticking up. And you can see the nest is way out here and way over to here, and this is a 4.5-inch bird. So this is just a very, very big nest for a pretty small bird. Really interesting way of doing what they do. I don't have any other warbler that does this. I'm just going to go through some numbers. It's a little bit, I know it's a little bit of, can glaze your eyes over, but it's kind of interesting. We're going to look really just at incubation and nestling, and then how long and who lives mostly. So that's just what we're looking at. And the thing is, so we have this way of calculating what we call the daily nest survival, which is, um, what's your chance of living at these different stages? And the main point here is that if you're a nestling, you have a higher chance of surviving to the next stage. It doesn't look like much, but it actually plays out to be significant. So if you're an egg, if you're a bird in an egg, your chances of living are less. And so you want to get out of the egg and you want to be a nestling. And then when you're a nestling, you want to get out of the nest and be an older bird. So it takes them 14 days to get out of that egg. These birds were very true to the number 14. They rarely hatched on 13 or as late as 15. They almost all did 14-day incubation, and then they almost all fledged on day 10. They're a very regular bird. So their cycle, 24-day, add a few days for building the nest, and you've got about a lunar month cycle for one nest. And then I calculated how many young per pair. And when my graduate student first did this and she came up with 1.5, I said, well, that's not sustainable. We really need two, on average, we need two babies per pair. And then she came back the next year and she said, I realized I only did this analysis based on the bird's first nest cycle. But later, as time went on, what we found out by having all those color banded birds and what they were doing, we found out that they were actually doing second and third nest attempts. We had one female that raised 10 young and three different nest cycles. All three were successful. So she had 4, 3, and 3. And so she actually raised 10 babies. And when Jennifer redid this based on the other data, the number came out to be like 2.1. So we had what we consider a sustainable population. So our two areas are the South Carolina and the Roanoke, and then other people have studied the birds. These guys in Arkansas, I forget where these folks were, but you can see that our study site and theirs, we had a nest success, that's when at least one baby fledges from the nest. We had 109 nests and a little over 60 fledged at least one baby Swainson's. On the Roanoke and in Arkansas, they had with 73 and over 120 respectively, they had a 30% success rate, so very different, much lower success rate, and just very different. That's why we sometimes repeat these studies in different locations and different ways, is because it's not always the same. A couple other factoids: both adults feed the nestlings, but once the babies leave the nest, the male takes over, and then the female will quickly re-nest if it's still before like July, mid-July, third week of July. She will attempt to re-nest into mid-July. We found some nests with babies in the nest into the first week of August, which is getting pretty late for a songbird. We had several cases with males had multiple females, just two. I had several birds. There were three, maybe four males, and they each had two females, never more than two. But that's interesting. Different social structure. We don't know why. And again, they will attempt nesting into mid. When I say nesting, that's the nest initiation, which means remember 24-day, 28-day cycle. They're not going to finish till the uh, middle of August if they start in mid-July. What about so? What about depredation? What about parasitism? So we found that um, anecdotally, we found snakes at some of our nests. So we set up a video study, and I'll show you the gear in a second. And the videos confirmed that it was, in fact, snakes were the main cause of depredation at the nest. We did have cowbirds parasitized, even in the forest. Uh, in South Carolina, we tracked 99 nests. 9 of them had cowbirds. Well, watching the Swainson's warblers, we determined they were naive hosts. They did not know what a cowbird was. They'd not been exposed to it long enough, so they didn't do anything to chase the cowbird away like some birds do. However, the other thing to note is that none of those nests succeeded. No young fledged from those 9 nests. Each one of them was depredated or failed from a storm or something, and so neither a cowbird nor a Swainson's warbler made it out of those nests. This is where the adults would take, especially the male, would take the young birds after they'd fledge. They go, it's already can be pretty tangly where we were working, but it's often open. You can see there's open areas here. The birds are feeding on this leaf litter here, and we could do our work. But then there'd be these, see there's a light gap here, and it gets really thick. And that's where they would take the babies. And that became obvious, and it also became obvious that we could not follow birds around. And so that's when we started doing some telemetry. So telemetry is where we take these transmitters, tie them onto a bird. I can't go over 5% of the bird's weight. So the birds are around 15 gram, and that's like 0.75. I usually kept the transmitters around 6 gram, zero point 0.6 gram rather, zero point 0.6. They beep at one frequency. We go out with our antenna and receiver, and we go and find the birds and get some data on them. And we had about anywhere from 10 to 15 wearing transmitters at any one time because we had lots of different frequencies we could use. The engineer could make the units last from 21 to 70 days, but the range really drops off when they last longer. So I had them do 45, so I could hear the beeping up to about 300 yards away. Although I tried some cotton thread here the first time, I quickly went to surgical thread. So here's a bird, I'm weighing it. You can't quite see it well enough, but it says 15.7, and it's actually got a transmitter on. There's a little antenna sticking out. You can't see it, but so that bird was 15.1 gram when we weighed it, and we put a transmitter on and let it go and got our day. This is what it looks like on their back. So it sits on their back. We then pull their feathers over. We sometimes color the silver with black and then let the bird go. Now, we found that the Swainsons could break these antennas. Their bill is so strong, so I had to have the engineer start putting Teflon coatings on them. And then the surgical thread disintegrates in a few months. If I can't catch the bird again, the thread will rot and the bird will break it and it will fall off. And so what we do is just go out and find the bird and take a GPS point, and we also note what they're doing, which is they're only going to be singing or feeding. If they're males, and if they're females, they're just feeding and flying back to the nest to feed the young. So we just want to do this we wanted to get like 30 points per bird so that we could calculate how much space they were using in that 45-day period. We just try to do one a day or one every other day. So here's that study site again. Here's the river coming down. Here's the loop in the river. And here's this little crossroad right here is our logging road system. So here's the crossroad here on the left. So you can see there's a yellow bird here and all the dots. There's a brownish green one here, a little bit bigger, and then a dark green thing here. These are the points we get. We plot them on the map. Gives us an idea of how much space the birds are using. The birds are different ages, and so they're going to have different experience levels and maybe different strength levels. So there's no surprise they end up occupying different amounts of territory. And here's just a stylized map. I turned this map 90 degrees to the right. This is to the right is north. And these are all the birds we had tagged in 2008. And when you calculate their acreage, you can see the young males never got a female, they never got a mate. So their territories were small, 5 acres. Some of them were as big as 25 acres. That's pretty big for a songbird. I mean, that's really big. But they're only feeding on the ground. They don't have a whole big tree that they can forage in like some other warbler. They can use a giant oak tree. These guys have a two-dimensional space. So they need a lot of space to get all the food. And here's the Roanoke River. And again, they're just going along contiguous fashion. If the habitat's good, this habitat right here in the middle is not good. There you go. They just line up side to side. But you can see like this one at the bottom is really big, but these guys here are really small. That was probably a young unmated male here, whereas this guy surely had a mate, if not two. Here's another big one. Neil said that they were also some were as small as 5 acres. Others went up to 40. That's almost unbelievable. I'd really have to double check the data on that. Like, are you sure? I mean, that's huge for a little warbler, but maybe so. Sometimes they would wander. Sometimes the bird would just pick up and go visit a neighbor territory way down here and come back. And that's an extra liminal record, and I don't calculate those in the overall averaging. And he might have had a few of those stray points in here, and it came up with 40 acres. I would say it's more like 5 to 25. So what do they eat? So Amelia did the diet study. The first thing she had to do was go out and scarf up leaf litter samples. She did 900 leaf litter samples with a vacuum cleaner. She would do 1 square meter plots. She would come back and put them in these funnels with a light and it drive all the insects down to the bottom of the container. And then that's what was on the menu. So that's what the options were. Then we would catch the birds here on the right. You got a little rubber tube, which we would squirt a little bit of tepid water, lukewarm water into their crop, not the stomach, just the crop, where they would have some, hopefully some samples. Really only about a third of the birds produced samples, and the crop samples are the choices. That was the choices they made. We got 165 crop samples. And then she had to sort through the crop samples. So she had to learn the whole bug. Like we just did it to like family and order. And then she had to learn parts of bugs and learn and try to get them to order. So this is what some of it looked like under the microscopes. Sometimes it'd be a leg, but she learned to figure out like what animal that came from. Obviously that's a spider, so that's easy. But some of these were pretty tricky, but she learned. She had help from Clyde Sorensen at NC State. And anyway, we got a good study out of that. And what she found was, in fact, that they preferentially went after spiders. A lot of spiders are in the leaf litter and these birds, that's what they're going after. And it turns out they're really high nutrition value in a spider. It may come a day when we're all eating spiders out there. There's a lot to be said for consuming a spider. And then they ate beetle. Beetle was like their second choice. Um, and it was interesting. They avoided hemipterans and probably homopterans too. And then we did a quick little trip to Guatemala at the end of the meal and oh Lord. We went down for like 10 days and we caught 8 birds, did a little telemetry, and um, Amelia took the crop samples from those 8 birds, and what she found was no spiders. Well, that's interesting because the guy in Jamaica only found beetles. So she found beetles in the birds in Guatemala, but no spiders. So maybe that they avoid tropical spiders. There may be something about the chemistry of a tropical spider that the birds know. That's a whole nother project for somebody. And so then the last thing we did was want to look at nest. Who was eating, who was doing the depredation on all these nests? And the only way to figure it out was do video camera, remote video camera. We had to go analog this year. Neil we were going to go digital, but there was a snafu and I forget what it was, but he went analog. We had to haul all these batteries out, marine batteries, every day, 1 or 2 batteries to wherever there was a nest, and then have the camera system set up with a VHS recorder, which could go for 48 hours. And so there was a lot of back and forth to get data on. We got 13,000 hours of video data. But what we learned was, and what we thought, and that is that I think he said 80% of the depredation events were black rat snakes. And then there was one incident each of a corn snake, a screech owl, a red-shouldered hawk, a Carolina wren even knocked some eggs out. Actually took the bird's nest, is what it was. Took the bird's nest material, not the eggs, the nest material. The eggs fell out. And then there were some harvestmen got into a nest where the young, I saw the video, the young was nearly dead. And so I think they were just scavenging. But still, it was interesting that they went in and found it. So anyway, we learned we showed what we thought was happening was that the main predator was a black rat snake. We did do a paternity study, or we tried. It was really hard. To do paternity, you need blood from both the parents and all the young. And the young have to be 6 days old or older in order for us to take a blood sample. Well, when your net success is only 30%, that that's a challenge because and then not all, so many of them never made it to day 6. So we only ended up with 23 samples. And but we found that there were 3 that showed what's called extra pair paternity. So take it for what it's worth. It makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. You just want to get different genes into the gene pool, so to speak, and that's one way to do it. So with that, I think I'm done. Yeah, you don't have to read that. Just a lot of people helped me out doing all this work, and a lot of people donated photos to me. A lot of folks in the timber industry were a big help. NC State, um, graduate students that went NC State. So anyway, it was a fine time. Um, I can't, my wife is very tolerant of me. I'm gone a lot. I travel a lot. I took her to Guatemala that year, and there she's holding a Swainson's warbler. And but yeah, I also acknowledge her support of me being out all the time, chasing birds all over the place. So anyway, that's that. So is there time for questions at all, or did I go too long?
We have time for questions if anybody wants to unmute themselves or put questions in the chat. I have a question. John, which of the birds are you most looking forward to seeing this fall migration?
Hmm. Wow. I don't go out and looking at birds anymore. Um, Partly I've lost so much hearing, but I can still see them. But um, I usually just go out, we work in central North Carolina and I go out and catch them. And so I would say in that sense, I'm always looking forward to the ones that we might have caught the year before or 2 years before or 3 years before and seeing which ones we'll catch again. We have some birds in our study that we've caught them like 6 years in a row, kind of like that water thrush I mentioned. There was some white-throated sparrows that just come back year after year. It's fascinating uh, to see them come back. So I guess that's sort of how where my bird brain is at. It's usually more about what I'm about to catch.
Speaking of catching, we do have a question. How do you catch the birds?
Yeah, I mentioned that we use these nets, and that's one way, but I'll describe the net. I should have thrown in a picture. These nets are like a big spider web, and we have different sizes. We have some that are uh, in length about 20 feet, some that are 30, some 40, even some that are 60 feet long, and they stretch out. And and then they're about 7 feet tall. When they stretch out, they're very fine, like nylon or polyester, uh, and they're little squares like a spider web, little squares, but they're like a 1 inch square. So most birds can't fly through, or they're even like 3/4 inch square. But when you put those nets, they're black. When you put them in front of vegetation, they disappear. I'm not gonna lie, I have walked into some once in. I know there's a net there because I put it there, but sometimes I'll be talking and not paying attention, and I walk right into it because you don't always see it. So the birds are flying along and they're eating or they're chasing each other. They don't see this net. And it's real stretchy. They stretch out, and then when it swings back, the weight of the bird causes it to sink into like a little pocket of the net, and then they get tangled by their toes, and we come along and take them out. Another way to do it is like a couple of my colleagues in the Wilmington area, we study painted bunting still. Those birds are always at the feeder. So Chelsea can go out with her little cage trap, take the main feeder down, put a little feeder inside the trap, and the trap is just a cage, hardware cloth, about 2 cubic around, and then we cut little holes in them, and the birds just find the holes and hop into the trap because they want to get to that feeder so badly. And then once they're in and we walk over, they can't figure out where the hole is to get back out. So we just reach in and grab them and we tag them. That's one way. And then another way is people studying waterfowl will use a ballistics net because waterfowl are in big flocks, right? You might have a flock of geese, for example, and you want to catch 75 blue snow geese out there at Lake Mattamuskeet. They'll have a net that's like 100 feet, 200 feet long, but you detonate some it's little rockets, and it shoots the net over the birds. It goes way up high, and then it drops down the other side. And so that's another way that people catch birds. There are different ways. Catching hawks, sometimes you'll put a little mouse inside of another kind of a cage trap with nooses on the top, and just throw it out on the ground or on the side of the road where you know that the hawk flies by, it sees the mouse, flies down to grab the mouth, but it lands on top of the trap, and then there's these nooses, and then it tries to pull its foot away, and it cinches a knot around the bird's foot, and so and you're just sitting there in the car watching. So when the bird gets caught, you get out, get the bird, tag it, let it go. So a different way, but we mostly use these things called mist net. They look misty, so they call them a mist net.
Does any of your work include tracking with the MODIS towers?
Well, yes. So Evan Buckland initiated the Cape Fear Bird Observatory, but she did her master's. Well, and I'm always fuzzy on the details. She did tracking, MODIS and something called CTT, which is cellular tracking technology. And there are two types of tracking. The CTT is a node system. You put out all these little boxes in the marsh. She was doing marsh sparrows down there, and um, and the birds fly around. It's like barcode reading at the grocery store. Every time they fly by a box within like 100 yards, they pick up a signal. And you might put 50 boxes out in the marsh, and you got tons of data on all your little birds that as they're flying around, they're getting picked up. And then Murray works with her, was at UNC Wilmington. They do MODIS towers. They both. So Murray did a lot of MODIS work with the marsh sparrow, and so they are also. We're now doing stuff with the painted bunting, both CTT and MODIS, and we are we're also trying to get something up in the central part of the state. We're just having this conversation with the property owners where I work, and also with a colleague at Catawba College. He got a grant to put up 4 MODIS towers in the Piedmont, and he's putting 3 up at small colleges out there, but he has a 4th one. And we were just discussing about maybe putting it up at the study site in the central part of the state. And if he does, then it has some of the grant money covers putting tags on some of the migratory birds. So we're still trying to work that out. So I'll be, hopefully
Yeah.
participating in that. Yeah.
And could you speak to some of the geochemistry differences between a brown water and a black water river? What makes them so different and special for birds?
I'm not real up on that, but I will tell you that the black water um, systems are very tannic. The acidity is very different. It's high acidity, so lower pH. And and so what you see are a different plant assemblage. And to me, anytime I've been in those systems, it's a reduced diversity of plant life, and that's not a bad thing. It's just, just that's it. The plants that are there are really adapted to a more acidic environment. When I go into, say, the brown water, and some people call it red water, brown water, when I go into those systems, the chemistry seems a little, well, it's not so acidic, and also there seem to be some different nutrients that allows for a higher diversity of plants. That's what I see. Many different kinds of trees and shrubs. And so, of course, once you have those different vegetation types, you're going to have different, different kinds of animals that are adapted to it. I know there's more to the story, but that I don't really know. I don't know. Paige, do you know anything about it?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo sort of the same comments. You're definitely going to have different plant assemblages, which are contributing to that tannic component. A lot of what's changing the water quality and composition of the Blackwater River is going to be that more bald cypress
Yeah.
composition that increases the tannins, especially in our eastern part of the state where we have a higher number of those Blackwater systems. But yeah, I don't see any other questions. Thank you so much for your time, John. And if
You're
anybody
welcome.
wants to spend more time with us and John, please come out to the museum in Whiteville on September 13th, where we'll have a full day of activities with John, birding, dissections, and education galore.